share your story with us.
Thank you. About a year ago, as we were reading through journaling, I was captivated by the story of David and his mighty 30 and the mighty 3. And I thought through that. I was fascinated by the fact, as Pastor Craig's already mentioned, the loyalty to King David, the devotion, the willingness to lay down their life for a cup of water. And as I was thinking through that, the Lord spoke to me, and he spoke one of those times, as he does with us so very, very clearly. He said, "So, who's in your mighty 30? And so I began this last year taking inventory in a different way than I've ever done before. I've given my testimony many times, shared my story, but never from this perspective. First of all, I want you all to know that I was born up in Albany, Kentucky, back in 1956. My mom, my dad, my sister, and I lived there for the first 8 years. And then we moved to Indiana because there wasn't very much available here in terms of work. So my dad went up there to get a better job. We were there from age 8 to age 13. My parents' marriage was pretty rough. We didn't live in a house that had much to do with alcohol or drugs, but there was a lot of violence, a lot of beatings. Beating after beating. We would wake up in the middle of the night, my sister and I, with blood flying, somebody's head ripped open. There were a few times one had to go to the hospital, get stitched up. There were other times when we thought for sure they might die there on the spot. So when they finally divorced at age 13, it was by then the happiest day of my life. I ended up living with my mom, as my sister did, and of course, them being so young, they had to start their lives over again, my parents, and so my sister and I were pretty much left on our own. I was an outgoing personality and strong personality, and rebellion was what I picked up. I surrounded myself by a group of people, kids in school. I was only 13, but I very quickly became quite familiar with drugs, with alcohol, different kinds of promiscuity. There really wasn't anything I didn't say no to. Through those teenage years, it was party after party, night after night, doing what I wanted to do. Before I was 14, I'd already been arrested. I had been running away, sneaking out my window at every opportunity. By 16, I was out on my own. My roommate and I we got an apartment, and so life for me from 16 to about 20 consisted of going to school if I could wake up and get there, lots of work because I needed to support my habits, and my habit was partying, and it was everything. Pastor Craig talked one time about how he had a false ID and he could get into the nightclubs. I had lots of IDs, so I went in as all kinds of aliases. I knew everybody in there. The bartender knew me. All of the people that were there knew me, and so they just let me in, as they did all of my friends. Now, I might add, this was back in the 70s. In the 70s, for those of you who grew up at the same time I did, it was a wild, wild time. My guidance counselor was right there in the nightclub partying with me. One of my teachers was the bartender. So I had people from every part of life right there with me. By the time I was in my late teens, I had developed an attitude. It was a feminist attitude, and it was, you think you'll use me, I'll use you more. I was determined, I was angry, I was strong-willed, I was in rebellion, and I decided no one, absolutely no one, would get over on me in my terms of thinking at that time. One of my drugs of choice was, of course, LSD and some of the other hallucinogenics, the psychedelic drugs. I can remember one time driving home, trying to get home, because I had to get ready for work. And I was so high, so very, very high, that I saw two roads. One was the real road, one was the imagined road, and I could only hope that I was on the real road. Somehow I made it home, time and time again. Somehow I survived. The sad thing is, by the time I was in my early 20s, I could count 25 friends and acquaintances that were dead. They were all drug and alcohol related. They were car accidents. They were suicides. They were accidental shootings. They were murders. They were overdoses. All of them, I knew I knew either very, very well. A couple of them were boyfriends. A couple of them were close friends. Others I partied with on a regular basis. One of the other really, really sad things about my life then was my parents had always gone to church. We would go to church on Sunday and fight Monday through Saturday. So I had very, very little regard for Christianity, for God, for Christ. I didn't see the value in it. I didn't see the benefit in it. One of the things I enjoyed doing when I was sitting in a nightclub was telling jokes about Christ, making fun of him, and declaring that the place to party was in hell, and that's where I wanted to belong. That's where I wanted to end up, because I wanted to party forever. When I was about 19, I had a dance partner that was a friend of mine, and he'd gotten into photography, and so he asked me if he could do a photo shoot with me. So he took a wide variety of pictures, and the pictures in and of themselves were pretty innocent. It was an outdoor setting, and I think, there you go. This is one of a couple of the pictures that I have, but there were a group of them. I want to point out these pictures ended up in a place called Lucifer's in Indianapolis, a popular nightclub. They revolved on the big screen there for quite a long time, and I thought, what a visual statement of where I was spiritually, in the hand of Satan. By the time I was in my early 20s, as I told you, I could count so many friends that were dead, and I decided I didn't really want to be in Indiana anymore. That was getting old. We were getting a little bored. So we decided it might be fun to do something different. My roommate and I at the time thought, Florida sounds good. I had a cousin that lived in Orlando, so I called him, and he said, come on down, we'll party here. So my friend and I packed up and drove to Florida, made it to Orlando, and my cousin had a roommate. His roommate's name was Jay. This Jay had also come from Indiana and had landed in Florida a couple of years before because he had been drug trafficking between Chicago and Indiana, and he knew there was a warrant out for his arrest, so he hightailed it out of Indiana and made it to Florida. The guys that were in the group with him that were involved in the drug trafficking didn't make it, and they ended up in prison for a number of years. Well, after we got to Florida, my roommate decided that she was bored, or not bored, but homesick, and so she decided to go back to Indiana, which left me there with my cousin and his roommate, Jay. Jay and I hooked up pretty quickly. Now, he was of like mind and lifestyle. We partied. He knew how to party better than me. He was still a drug dealer. He had every drug that was attractive to us and attractive to the friends around him. And so we moved in together, and we spent a life of partying at nighttime, working in the daytime. Now, I was pretty responsible in spite of my irresponsibility. I always worked really, really hard on the job. At times I held down 2 jobs because I had certain things to support, and I always made it to work. Well, once we got to Orlando, for those of you who are in banking, you've heard of SunTrust. It used to be Sun Bank, and the very first bank, Sun Bank, was started there in Orlando. That's where I landed a job. Now, I'd like to back up. As I was thinking through my Mighty 30 and my Mighty 3, the very first one I remember was my Granny Miller up in Albany. I can remember her getting down on her knees at the couch and praying for hours and hours. There she is. And she would pray for all of us, and she would pray subtle prayers, innocent prayers like, Lord, if she's drinking, make her so sick she'll just gag and not be able to survive it. Or, Lord, if she's in a wrong relationship, and she knew I was, make her so sick, make her so unhappy, make it so unbearable, she'll have to get out. And so she was praying, and she was praying diligently. And looking back, of course, I'm very, very grateful. When I got my job at Sun Bank, the woman that hired me was a woman by the name of Eileen Foster. She was a retired missionary out of and there she is. She was out of the Missionary Alliance Church, and if you're not familiar with the Missionary Alliance Church, it's a pretty traditional church and maybe old school, and very, very conservative. But she knew who I was. She knew what I was doing when I clocked out. She knew what my lifestyle was, but she was always incredibly good to me. I have never met someone who showed the love of Christ on a daily basis. She was so kind, she was so gentle, she was so supportive, so loving, and I know she was praying on the side for me because, again, she knew who I was. Over about a 2-year period, the relationship that I had with Jade deteriorated, and it deteriorated to the point where it was a disaster. He wasn't coming home at night. He was gone for days at a time. He would come home with drugs like crazy, and there was no limit to the type of drugs that he was interested in, no limit to the type of drugs that we participated in. Thankfully, the only one I didn't contribute to was anything that had to do with needles. That scared me too much. So after about 2 years of a really awful relationship, I finally decided, Granny was praying, and I couldn't stand it anymore. So I decided it was time to bow out. I moved out, tried to make it for a couple of months there in the area, but it was so hard. My heart was ripped out. It was a painful and awful love, but it was the only love I had. And so it was hard to let go of it. And I was struggling quite a bit. By now, I'd been promoted at SunTrust or Sunbank, and I had a new boss. Eileen was still there in the bank and still very supportive and still interacting with me. But my new boss, Dick McAllister, was also very, very kind and very, very helpful. And I went to him and I said, I'm not doing well. So he said, take some time off and see if that helps. If you decide that you find something else you want to do, then I'll replace you. If not, you've still got a job. So I packed up the few things I had and decided that maybe Chicago would be fun. My mom and my stepdad lived outside of Chicago at the time, and so I headed up that way. Now, this was in January, which was pretty bad timing because the weather was horrendous. I was in Chicago a few days. It snowed to the 3rd floor of the apartment building, and I decided that's not what I wanted. So I thought Plan B looks good. I'll go to Indiana and see what's going on there. So I headed back to Indiana, where I came from. Met up with an old friend, decided while I was there that I'm going to go back to Florida and face my problems. I'm going to meet them head on and overcome them. Well, I met a friend of mine, a close friend of mine there in Indiana, and the night before I was scheduled to leave, we went out and partied. We partied as hard as we could party. There was a massive amount of alcohol. There was a massive amount of drugs. I got back to my dad's house about 4 o'clock in the morning, planning to leave about 6 because it was a 20-hour drive ahead of me. Still very, very drunk, still very, very high, somewhat maybe moving into hangover, very little sleep. And so I started to get my car. Thankfully, my dad gave me a CB because we didn't have cell phones back then. Again, we're in the 70s. He gave me a CB in case I got into trouble. And just as I was leaving, now my dad has become a Christian by this time, and he said to me, I know what can help you. I have some answers for you. And I knew where he was going with that, and I had no interest. Drop the religion, I'm not interested. So he said, okay. But he was praying for me, and he was concerned about me, and he was one of those mighty 30. I got in my little car. I had a Datsun B210 at the time. For those of you who might remember those, they were lightweight and a great economy car. And I'm driving along a couple hours into my travels. I'm coming down off of the alcohol and the drugs, and I'm getting really sleepy. I'm exhausted, and I'm hungover, and I feel awful. And so I had to combat that if I was going to make the trip. So I started hitting Black Beauties. For those of you that don't know what those are, it's speed. So I was hitting those hard. I was just, every little bit, I was hitting another hit of speed, taking another hit of speed. I got down into, on 65, into the hills of Chattanooga. By then, I've hit a huge snowstorm. The roads are covered. My car is really lightweight, so it's prone to skidding and sliding. And so thankfully I had the CB and I had it on, and this truck driver was in front of me. And so he radioed to me, little darling, stay in my tracks, I'll get you through this. So I headed down through his tracks, and sure enough, he got me out of the snowstorm, and I made it into Georgia and headed on from there. By 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm back in Florida, and for those of you who maybe know the Florida Turnpike, it's a long, desolate, bleak track of road, and there are very few gas stations, no houses, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, There aren't very many other cars. Again, now I'm coming down off of the Black Beauties. I'm coming down the hangovers there. I'm out of Black Beauties. I've been up for 20-something hours with just a couple hours sleep. And my car starts to miss, and it's missing. And I'm thinking, this car is going to die. And I'm going to be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere. I didn't think about all the mass murderers that hang out in Florida. I didn't think about all the weirdos that are attracted to Florida. All I could think of was snakes and alligators going to get in my car and eat me. And so that just terrified the daylights out of me. So I said, time for a deal. Lord, God, if you're there, you get me out of this and I'm yours. Immediately, absolutely immediately, what do you think? The car just took off. It didn't skip a beat after that. And in 45 minutes, I was back in Orlando at my cousin's house. I kept my promise. The next day, I got up, knelt down by my bed, and gave my heart to the Lord. From that moment on, this God of ours is so spectacular. From that moment on, I didn't drink again. I didn't do drugs again. And my language cleaned up. I went back to the bank, and my boss was phenomenal. He was so receptive and so helpful and so loving. Eileen was still there. Granny was still praying. And then all of these other friends I started meeting that were Christians. I got plugged into a church. Things were going well. I started getting promotions at the bank. I bought a house. Life was good. For that first 3-year period, I got saved at 22. For that next 3-year period, life was spectacular. Things were going really well. I was learning and growing and experiencing the Lord. He became very real to me. Got baptized in the Holy Spirit. Life was great. And then Jay came back into my life. So we hooked up again. We both played softball. So we hooked up again, and I'm thinking, you know, I've been a Christian a while. I can missionary him. And we can make this good. We can have a life together. Well, I had great plans. He didn't. We did decide that we would get married, and so we were engaged. But he was still dealing drugs on the side. He was still partying, because sometimes we love our addiction more than life. And he was addicted. One day I was driving down Colonial in Orlando at 436, which probably says nothing to you, but I stopped at that intersection at that red light, and the Lord spoke to me very clearly, and he said, "This is not my will for you. Give that ring back." So I was devastated, but I wanted to obey. So I turned around, drove back, wrote a note, "It's over, I need to break it off," laid the ring down and left. And he left. He left out of my life. Just a few weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant. So I had to deal with the devastation and the embarrassment and the shame of being pregnant in a time as a single woman when pregnancy wasn't as common with single women as it is today or as accepted. It was still taboo. People still looked down on us, and it was a tough time. But I had this God that loved me so much. So he took all these people in the bank around me, and they said, "We love you. We'll walk you through this. We'll see you through it." They had baby showers for me. They bought me everything I needed. They took care of me. They wanted to go into labor and delivery with me. I mean, they were just there for me in every regard. They babysat for me after my son was born, and they just took such great care of me. As a result of what I went through, let me back up just a little. When I discovered I was pregnant, I of course called Jay and said, "I'm pregnant." He said, "Well, you've got a choice. You've embarrassed me, you've humiliated me. You can get an abortion. That's it." And he walked out. He had nothing more to do with me. As a result of everything I went through with that pregnancy and everything that I went through afterwards, being an unwed mom and trying to get reestablished and deal with all of the difficulties that are involved in being a single mom, I became very much aware of the issue of abortion. Now, this is back in the early 80s, 1982 to be exact, and most of the church then really didn't know where they stood on the issue of abortion and really didn't know much about it. It was just starting to become a social issue and a moral issue, and most people just really weren't familiar. As I became more and more familiar with the issue of abortion and being an unwed mom and what life was like out there and discovering that there were others out there just like me, I just really became burdened with wanting to do something more. So I spent a couple of weeks in prayer and fasting and decided that I would leave the bank where I worked. And that was a really hard thing to do because by now I'd had so many promotions. I had my own branch. I was managing a branch. I had made a name for myself in the bank through sales, and I had done really very well. But I left the bank and I began a ministry called Beginnings to Beginnings. We set it up as a nonprofit organization, and we began to work with the very few other ministries there in Orlando that had to do with reaching out to that unwed mom to fight the issue of abortion. Beginnings to Beginnings lasted for about 4 years. There were over 100 women that went through my group. They ranged from ages 15 to 40, and they came from every walk of life. Some of them were drug addicts, some of them were runaways, some of them had experienced tremendous amounts of abuse, some of them were rape victims. They were drug and alcohol related. They dealt with eating disorders. They dealt with the demonic. I mean, it was endless what we dealt with. Everything. I was faced with everything, and to be quite honest, I wasn't equipped or prepared for some of this. And so I struggled through. But you know what? Eileen Foster was right there with me. She'd pray for me. She'd support me. She was on my board. I had an associate pastor and his wife that we would go picket abortion clinics. We went to Washington, D.C. To fight for the Walk for Life up there. And they surrounded themselves. I was in a life group then, if you will, and that life group was so supportive to me. They took care of me. They walked me through things. They helped me financially because I was starving. Early on into the ministry, the first thing that happened to me is I went into foreclosure and lost my house. So one of the guys that was in our life group was going to be out of his home for about 6 months, so he gave that to me. The needs were met in such a variety of ways. And I want to give you an example of one. This is small and really insignificant in the big picture, but it was so powerful to me. One day my son was now 3 years old, Aaron, and he needed to go to a birthday party. I had about $9 in my pocket, and that was it. I didn't have any more money. I needed to also get some groceries because there was absolutely nothing at home. So, believe it or not, I battled. Do I get a birthday present? Do I get food? Well, finally, food won out. I stopped at a vegetable market to pick up a few things, and I knew that I was within my limits as far as the money I had. I walked up to pay, and when I got to the cashier, I laid the things down, she rang them up, and a man walks up from out of nowhere, pays for my food, turns around and walks away, didn't look at me, didn't speak to me, he just paid. That kind of stuff began to happen to me on a regular basis. This Lord of mine was covering me and taking care of me. He let me go through the really tough times because that's how we grow up. I needed all those tough times. But he was there too to walk along with me. Every step I took, he was right beside me. Now, as I had beginnings, my stepdad, who was a phenomenal individual, he was very, very young at the time. He was a diabetic, type 1. He had tremendous health issues. He had lost his kidney function early on. He had lost his eyesight in one of his eyes. He had lost hearing because of a staph infection. He had tremendous problems with his legs. He had no feeling in his feet. When he lost his kidney function, he went on dialysis for a while. Now, those of you who are in the medical field, you know that 30 years ago, dialysis was not as developed as it is now. And so he struggled a lot. He lived in constant pain because they would either dialyze him too much or not enough. So he spent most of his life laying on the floor in his TV room praying. He decided he could do nothing else. He'd be a prayer warrior. So he would take the list of all of the women in my group, all of my moms, and their babies and their situations, and he'd pray over them and pray over them and pray over them. And he'd contribute wherever he could contribute. He'd babysit for me as often as he possibly could. So he was, in my mind, my granny, Eileen, and Ken being the first three in the three. Finally, after about 4 years, I was burned out. I couldn't do the ministry anymore. It was an uphill battle. I couldn't get much support. I had the support of a few, but I didn't have the support that you need to reach out to that many people and to be available to the degree that I had to be available. And it was 24/7. I had a pastor at the church that I went to, and I went to him and I told him about beginnings and what we were doing, and he said, Sherry, and this is where we were in the abortion issue back then, so understand where it was coming from. He said, Sherry, I absolutely appreciate what you're doing, having babies and all that. You need to talk to my wife, and she'd love hearing your stories. But Sherry, I'm in the business of saving souls, so I need to be busy with this. And I can remember one time bringing a bunch of my moms and their babies into church with me, and his wife, of all people, saying, here comes Sherry and her strays again. There wasn't much reception for that issue back then. It's amazing how far it's come, actually. Finally, at about 4 years, I couldn't go on any longer. I was burned out. My son wasn't getting much of my time. I was just so consumed with beginnings, I decided I needed to bow out, so I resigned. I decided that I needed to get away and regroup, so I moved back up to Kentucky. It so happens that my granny, the one that had been praying for me, had been diagnosed with dementia, and now we know it was Alzheimer's. So I came up and stayed with her for 2 years, trying to regroup, get my head back on, and figure out where I went from there. After about 2 years, we discovered that my stepdad was getting sicker and sicker, and his future was very, very limited. So I decided to go back to Florida and help out with him, thinking maybe now would be the time that the Lord would give me the next phase of ministry. I got back to Florida, and he died, of course, in January 1991. For the next year, I started a little cleaning business because I wanted to be with my son. I loved homeschooling. I homeschooled from the very beginning. So I did a cleaning service, helped take care of my grandparents, Ken's parents, because they were also diabetics, and just began to live life for the next year or so. In early 1992, my old pastor and his wife I had seen at a meeting, and they said, you know what, we need to hook you up with somebody. Now, I didn't date. I had such an awful life and such an awful experience before. I just really did not want to bring dating into the picture because I didn't want my son to have to struggle with men in and out of my life and just the being that the instability of that. So I just didn't date. But then this Pastor Gary, and his wife said, we have somebody we want you to meet. We think that you guys might really hit it off. His name was Randy Huck. Well, we met. 3 weeks later, we were engaged. 5 months later, we were married. I was 36, he was 41. We had to work fast. Now, up until that point, I had already had so many people in my life supporting me, loving me, taking care of me. You know, in my pregnancy, people came over and mowed my yard, brought me food, just were there for me. They loved me in such a huge variety of ways. I would have never made it to where I was or to where I am today without all of that support. Randy and I were married in November 1992, and this picture is significant. Our wedding was done in all white because it represented the purity that the Lord had given me as a result of his forgiveness. And as you can see, the wedding was at First Baptist in Orlando. You could see the stained glass up above with the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. And that's where I was. The Lord had brought me out of the trash heap and into a marvelous place of life. After Randy and I married, it was spectacular. Everything in that wedding came true for me. I always wanted candles in a wedding. I had 292 candles. It just came with the service. The Lord was incredibly, absolutely incredibly good to me. And of course, Randy and I got married. One of the things that he did for me that absolutely stunned me. Just before we got married and we were talking about getting married, I told him, "You need to know all of me." So I told him everything there was to tell. I told him about all the trash, the drugs, the alcohol, the promiscuity, the rebellion, the anger, everything. And he still loved me. He still loved me. He still thought I was beautiful. That stunned me because I couldn't imagine anybody seeing something like this as beautiful. So we married. And then, to add icing onto the cake, he wanted to adopt my son. He wanted to make him his own. So when we had our wedding, we also had an adoption service, and Aaron got to become a Huck the same day I did. We started our new family, and we asked the Lord to give us what he wanted for us. We were open to whatever he might bless us with. We wanted a family, we wanted more family, but again, at our age, we didn't know what we'd get. We got 5 kids in 7 years. So that was pretty exciting. But also, for those of you who are blended families, you know that's not an easy road to walk. There's yours, mine, and ours, and it's tough. We went through some incredibly tough times. There were times, actually, we weren't sure we'd make it. There were times when the love that we used to have turned to hate. But you know what? Again, the Lord provided for us through our church people who would pray for us, who would support us. We had a couple who counseled us that had also been in a blended family and walked the walk we were walking. And so they helped us to get to where we are today. They were also the ones, by the way, that introduced us to Cleansing Stream, which was a phenomenal ministry that got us on the other side of our marriage. Now, after we were married, of course, we had 5 kids, as I said, in 7 years. The 4th of those children was Kaylee, and all of you know Kaylee. When she was born, she was Down syndrome. We didn't know ahead of time that she would be Down syndrome. Had no indication because everything in the pregnancy was just like all of my other pregnancies. When she was born, and I was fortunate enough to have pretty quick and easy deliveries. It took about 45 minutes. And the moment I saw her, I knew she was Down syndrome. But I didn't know what that would mean, and I was terrified. They immediately rushed her out of the room because she had aspirated some of the amniotic fluid and she was turning blue, and so they put her in NICU. And a little bit later, the NICU doctor came in and told Randy and I that they strongly suspected that she was Down syndrome, and that with Down syndrome comes typically a whole host of health issues. Again, being older, that terrified us because if she had a huge variety of health issues and problems, who would take care of her? Who would be there for her? Who would pick up when we had to leave off? Within 45 minutes to an hour after she was born, I had some of my closest friends running into the hospital to sit there with us, to hold our hands as we got the report, and the report after that, and the report after that as to what we were dealing with. And before we knew it, we had a room full of people in there praying with us, praying for us, declaring a new ministry, declaring that everything was good and this was just the next phase of life. And that was all true. As you all know today, she's phenomenal. She exceeds everything that a typical Down syndrome person does. So we're incredibly grateful for her. A couple of years after that, Kaylee was born in 1999. We thought it was appropriate to have at least one more, so we did. And Kendall was our last. Kendall decided that she really, really liked being assisted in going to sleep every night. And so even at age 3, I was still rocking her and trying to get her to sleep each night. And one night I was rocking her. And by now, Aaron, our oldest son, has moved out. And he's moved into rebellion. He's having some of his own struggles. I knew he wasn't struggling with drugs or alcohol like I did. Those didn't really appeal to him, although he probably tried them. He loved road racing. He absolutely loved it. And he was just dumb enough that he didn't consider any of the possibilities of, or the disasters that could happen, because he was a teenager. He was out road racing, and I knew he was in trouble. I was praying for him that night, and as I was praying for him and praying quite intensely, I had a vision. And in that vision, the policeman came to the door to tell me he was dead, that he'd been in a car accident. It was so vivid. It was so real. It was so intense that I couldn't even cry. It gripped me so. I couldn't breathe because it was so real. And so I said, right there and then, there's a new prayer to pray. God, I want you to take this boy, do what you have to do to consume his life and transform his heart. I ask two things. Please don't take his life, and don't allow him to take anyone else's life. That was in December 2002. As I began to pray, I prayed that every single day because I was so terrified. May 23rd, 2002, I got a phone call. Now, Aaron had moved out a couple of years ago, but we still, of course, saw him. He was right there in Melbourne where we lived. At the time, we had moved to Melbourne from Orlando, so that's understood. The phone call came, and it was Aaron. He said, Mom, I need you to sit down. I got to talk to you. So I sat down. He said, have you seen the news? I said, no, darling. He said, Mom, I'm in trouble. I'm in jail. Joey and I, Joey being one of his closest friends and also a son of two of our closest friends. We all went to church together. We all homeschooled together. We all fellowshiped together. We were as close as families can be. Joey and I decided last night for fun we'd rob a gun shop. I was devastated. They thought it would be so cool to rob this gun shop, take those guns and sell them, make a little money, go out and have a little target shooting, have a little fun, not thinking through exactly what that might mean. So from May 23rd to July 29th, we went through one of the most horrendous roller coasters I've ever been on. At one point, it looked like he and Joe were going to go to a federal prison. Let me back up. That night when they robbed the gun shop, the gun owner came in, saw somebody in his shop, and started shooting. Joe got shot. The bullet went in his wrist and came out his elbow, thankfully. As we began to walk through that 2-month period, Randy lost weight like crazy. I didn't. That frustrated me. We cried a lot, we prayed a lot, but again, we had this church family that loved us so much. They were sending us cards, they were calling us, they were showing up at our house, they were praying with us. We had one individual at our church that worked for the local police unit, and he was a detective, and so he went out and started getting information for us. He was our advisor. He walked us through every step of it. It went from that the boys may end up in a federal prison for 30 years because it was a gun issue to they ended up youthful offender. Thankfully, the Lord intervened, and they ended up in a youthful offender facility there in Melbourne for 3 years. Thus began our time in prison. Our kids, Kendall was age 3, and every weekend, every holiday we spent in prison. Our kids knew how to raise their hands real fast and take off their shoes so they could be frisked. They knew all of the guards, and actually, as horrible as it was a spectacular time because we got to learn about prison ministry and what goes on in there and what we could do to make a difference. Aaron, after 2.5 years, was released as a model prisoner, and so was Joe. There was a young lady that Aaron had met just before going into prison and was committed to him. She was an amazing young lady, and so she stuck with him. Every time we hit the prison doors, she was right there with us. So when he was released in February 2006, they had decided they would marry, and so we had a wedding in May 2006. Randy and I had also decided that it was time to move out of Florida, so June 30th, 2006, we moved up here into the Byrdstown area. We very quickly made this our church home. We met Craig and Tina and Don and Jackie and all of you, and we fell in love. As you all know now, we're not dealing with anything like prison. We're not going through any of those huge traumatic things that can just rip you apart. But now we're dealing with aging parents. My dad lives with my sister who has Alzheimer's. My mom lives with me with a whole variety of health issues. And so as we walk down that road, my most recent support have been, of course, my kids. They're right there with me to help with my parents and to help me get through each day. So many of you here have prayed for us so many different times as we've had a health crisis with one of them. And as we start to wind down and get ready to say goodbye to them. I want to end all of this by saying I've lived 2 lives already. I lived one in the trash heap. I lived the other as a Cinderella. You saw that in the wedding. It absolutely astounds me that this Lord of ours could love somebody like me, the worst of the worst, the sleaziest of the sleaziest, the trashiest of the trashiest. And he could take what I was and he could bring me to where I am now. You'll notice that I like wearing white sometimes, and it's because it represents the purity. It represents the forgiveness. It represents this precious Lord of whom I serve is in me. I'm also absolutely amazed that the Lord would give me so many people to support me. David had a mighty 30. Now, if you go back and read, you'll find that it was actually 37 at one point, but there were probably more than that because as men would die out or things would happen, they would be replaced. So there were actually many, many more. I had the major 3, which would be my granny, Eileen, who loved me so much and showed me the love of Christ, even though she was probably horrified at how I lived. And then, of course, my stepdad, who was so faithful, and in spite of all of his suffering, he devoted all of his time to prayer. And then, of course, Randy, who would love me so much. We go back and we look, there were the mighty 3, and then there was the leader of the 3. Randy would be him. Now, as I close in all of this, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. I'd like to, first of all, challenge you today to take inventory of your life, because I'm nothing special. If the Lord can do all of this for me, I know he's probably done it for every one of you out there. Take inventory of your life. And then I want you to ask yourself, who's in your mighty 30 and 3? And then I'd like for you to also consider, whose mighty 30 are you serving in? I want to point out that if all of us are receiving the blessing of those who are willing to serve us, and then if we're in turn striving to play a part in others' lives as they go through difficult times, those people that served me weren't all there at the same time. They were there at strategic times, at very specific times, with specific needs and problems and issues. There's something that I discovered as I was reading through all of this. If we're all working together and we're all serving one another and we're all playing that part where we would lay down our life for another to get a cup of water, if we're all doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're going to have something called a tapestry effect. Now, when Randy many years ago was traveling, he went through Egypt, and he picked up this rug, and I think, Chris, you have a picture. This is the rug. If you look on the back of it, it's amazingly organized and detailed. Each thread has a specific place and a particular function. They all work together, they overlap, they interact, and together they create an incredibly beautiful finished product. That's what Christianity is actually supposed to be. If all of us are interacting, if all of us are supporting one another, if all of us are encouraging one another and playing our part, it'll be very, very organized, very, very detailed, and we will be something so spectacularly beautiful as a Christian community to the eyes of those out there who want to be a part of something beautiful. I looked up the definition of tapestry, and it is, in the dictionary by Farlex, a colorful and complicated situation. I thought that was spectacular. Me being one of the more colorful in the picture. And I know there are others out there in this group that are also have some colorful things that they can add. If we all put it together, it is quite complicated, but it's quite beautiful. Aaron is posting some of my Mighty 30. Now, this is just some of them because I was going through the names, and I know I've missed some. There are so many here in this building today that have supported us in phenomenal ways, and we are so grateful. I hope that all of you understand that we love you so very, very much. And more importantly, I love my Lord and my Savior. He has been so incredibly good to me. Thank you.